Welcome everyone, Costini here with the discussion about the Sega Wonderland Sale that does affect the Total War games, not just Total War Warhammer, but Total War in general, and well, pretty much everything else that Creative Assembly is doing. There are significant discounts available for the next couple of days, and so I want to talk about DLCs, DLC packs, which of them are worth picking up, which of them are not worth picking up. I'll make a future video on that subject, but for this video I'm talking about essential DLC packs that you may want to get to play certain races. When I say essential, I'm talking about DLCs that add a significant amount to the races they do affect. Now, I'm not going to talk about Skaven in this video. I've done a separate video on that subject. I'll link it at the end of this one if you're interested in that, but it comes down to Prophet and Warlock versus Shadow and Blade. From my perspective, both of them are really important DLCs if you're looking to play the Skaven. I would recommend Shadow and Blade versus Prophet and Warlock if you're looking to make a choice and you're not willing to buy both of them. Anyway, so for this video, we start with the Grim and the Grave DLC that came out for Warhammer 1. Now, what's the importance of this particular DLC? It is the principal DLC affecting Regiments Renown for the Empire. So, and the Vampire counts. So if you want to use Regiments Renown for both of these races, then you want to pick up this particular DLC. That is one of the important things. It does add several important units for the Vampire counts, but you can be quite fine in a Vampire count campaign even without this DLC. It's not essential for them. It is nice to have, however. However, for the Empire, the situation is quite different. If you're looking at playing an Imperial campaign, you need both Imperial DLCs to make that work. The Empire is in a pretty bad state and they need all the help they can get. Now, this is not as significant as the other one, but in comparison to the Skaven, where you can actually play campaigns even without any of the DLC, for the Empire, I would strongly recommend, if you're looking to play an Imperial campaign, that you purchase both DLC packs. For this one, what you're getting, beyond the Regiments Renown, is the Archlector Lord choice. Now, Archlectors are flat out better than Generals of the Empire, and in some ways better than Huntsman Generals. Like, Huntsman Generals are worse in battle, but they're better on the campaign map. But Archlectors, the reason they're so important is they give you the entire chain over here. You can get this with a Warrior Priest, but an Archlector will get access to this earlier. So basically you can start investing in this chain, the Grand Hammer of Sigmar chain, the moment you get an Archlector to rank 2. Now, the Grand Hammer is not too crucial, though 24 melee attack is very nice, especially considering the bad stats that a lot of Imperial infantry have. So like going from 32 with 24 for regular swordsmen would be a significant advantage for Imperial units. In fact, melee attack in general for Imperial units does leave quite a bit to be desired. So having a significant increase in melee attack for them with the Grand Hammer Sigmar would be useful. The Grand Shield of Faith, which gives 20% damage resistance to all units in range, is again also very useful for those units in those 35 meters, because Imperial infantry just can't survive damage. And then the crucial ability is the Grand Soulfire. The way you use Archlectors and Warrior Priests is you send them in the middle of an enemy army, and ideally you have as much of the enemy army as possible converge on them. And because you have a significant amount of damage resistance with the Grand Shield of Faith, you can then use Grand Soulfire to just wipe out significant portions of the enemy army doing so. This is not a spell. It doesn't cost Winds of Magic. This is one of the few benefits the Empire does have in its campaigns. Like, using Archlectors and Warrior Priests is one of the few areas of genuine combat strength that the Empire does have compared to other factions. In many ways, the Empire is in a bad state. Their heroes, their captains, for instance, are not great. Their mages, while they certainly have access to quite a bit of powerful magic, they're not the best in the game. Witch Hunters are only really good for scavenging post-battle. And basically Warrior Priests and Archlectors as Lords, as the Lord version of the Warrior Priests, are the things that keep you going in a campaign. So having archlectors that are part of this DLC is something that is quite significant. And don't ignore the Regiments Renowned, because they're also quite important. You need every advantage you can get your hands on if you are going to play in an Imperial campaign. An added benefit to this, if you will, is that while Volkmar has a really rough campaign and a miserable start, and the Books of Nagash mechanic is not a great one, especially because you have to sail all the way to Safri to take the one from the White Tower of Hoof. That's a fun experience, because it's likely going to be under control of Valarial and Tyrion by the time you arrive. Or you're going to have to piss off a faction that's allied to both of them if Safri's still alive. Well, that's not good. Volkmar does, in quite a few ways, have the most playable campaign. While it is a very rough start, they all have rough starts except Marcus Wolfhard. While it is a rough start, because of the significant amount of power you can gain with the books, Volkmar can become the strongest legendary lord of the Empire. Marcus Wolfhard is much better in the early game. Volkmar is better in a long campaign. And don't get me started about Gelt or Karl Franz. Their campaigns are just flat out terrible. So that's the value of this DLC. I would say it's worth it if you're looking to play an Imperial campaign. And look, the Empire is the most popular race in the entire setting. It's the most popular race in the game. It's got the largest number of mods. So having this DLC is pretty important. At number 4, we have the Queen of the Crone DLC that affects the High Elves and the Dark Elves. This DLC is very important for the High Elves, not necessarily so important for the Dark Elves, though it is the DLC that contains the largest collection of Regiments Renowned for both of these races. So if you're looking to have Regiments Renowned for the Dark Elves, this is the DLC to recommend. However, this DLC is really all about the High Elves, and it's not the units themselves that are important as part of this DLC, though you do get Sisters of Avalorn as part of this DLC, which do give the High Elves an endgame ranged option that has magical attacks and armor piercing. So Sisters are just the upgrade from Archers with light armor. Whether or not you need to use them in a campaign depends on the course of the campaign and what you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a lot of heavily armored foes where your archers with light armor just can't tackle them, then getting Sisters is worth it. Though there are plenty of people that have completed a lot of campaigns without ever using anything besides spearmen and archers with light armor. So there is that argument to be made when it comes to the usefulness of the Sisters of Avalorn. However, there is no disputing the fact that the hero the High Elves get as part of this DLC is probably the most broken hero in the entire game. And especially if you're playing Alariel, who comes as part of this DLC, you'll be getting a lot of these handmaidens in a campaign, because as opposed to every other legendary lord of the High Elves who can only increase handmaiden capacity at tier 4, you can increase handmaiden capacity at tier 3. Alariel is an absolutely insane legendary lord. While she does have her issues, the construction cost and income from buildings being reduced, or construction costs being increasing, income from buildings being reduced for much of her early game, she does have an absurd level of power potential in her campaign that shouldn't be ignored. Regardless, the handmaidens as a hero choice is what makes this DLC quite essential. If you're looking to play any long High Elven campaign, for a short campaign they won't necessarily matter, but for a long campaign, very, very important to have this DLC. Let me explain. What handmaidens do is the following. They have this skill line over here, and they have this particular skill. Now, the Favored Divisha gives you 1 control in all provinces in this stack. So the more handmaidens you have, the more control you have. This is particularly important for the High Elves, because the High Elven economy works much better if you have 100 control. So if you can get 100 control in a particular province, your income buildings would generate 50% more income. So you're going for 300 to 450 income on the Elven Fairground. Or for the Promenade, you're going from 120 to 180. Or actually 360 if you get it all the way to tier 5. The High Elves are certainly the kind of race that grows stronger as you play them in the campaign. They start out a bit weaker than other races, but they certainly have a good enough early game army to handle all the threats. And as you get more and more settlements, get research unlocked, get hero capacity, they become quite a nightmare to deal with. Now, handmaids are good partly because of that control, partly because they have replenishment. So nobles do give you replenishment, but handmaidens, well, they give you replenishment and growth, so they have their own benefits there. So you can grow those settlements faster, which is always nice to have. But then they have a skill line choice. 2 of these will buff their combat ability, like either Guardian and hit points for melee combat ability, or you can buff the range ability. However, while hawkish precision is not something to sneeze at, far from it, the reality is you always want to go for Diplomat of the Everqueen chain. The reason is that while initially it only gives you 2 diplomatic relations with High Elves, it then turns into 2 diplomatic relations with all factions. Then you get 5% income from trade tariffs and 1 influence per turn. This alone is a major economic buff. And combined with diplomacy, allowing for more trade agreements to be reached because of that diplomatic benefit, this ends up being an absolutely absurd level of diplomatic power that you can reach in a campaign. And with more influence, you can recruit better heroes, you can recruit better lords, you can screw around with intrigue at court far more, and manipulate the campaign map in your favor. This is what makes handmaidens absurdly strong. And it's the handmaidens and Alariel's benefits to those handmaidens. The 2 hero capacity she does have, her ability in her campaign to recruit more of these handmaidens. So she gets +3 hero capacity for handmaidens, but she also gets recruitment in all provinces, so you can recruit them very quickly to the front line. I would always go with tradition dictates as opposed to blood and fire. Blood and fire is, as far as I'm concerned, not worth it at all compared to what tradition dictates. Like, this is to control all provinces, and you get actually 2 hero capacity for handmaidens to recruit rank. So we're looking at, in her campaign, you're looking at recruiting 5 handmaidens without even needing the structure for them. Because you always have 1 hero capacity by default, you get 2 from faction effects, you get 2 from her lord effects. That is an absurd level of power, and it ends up scaling up and up and up. Obviously, you can benefit from this to a certain degree if you confederate Alariel, sure, but you'll have this benefit from very, very early on in her campaign. Once you get her special skill line unlocked, which simply requires you to get to rank 12. Crazier thing about handmaidens, because they give you control and diplomatic relations benefit, that basically means that the Sword of Cain is no longer an issue. Like, those are 2 of the downsides of the Sword of Cain: diplomatic relations control. Well, you have a way of directly counteracting that. This is what makes Alariel ridiculous, but any legendary lord of the High Elves will benefit from handmaidens in their campaign. Yes, I know, it is absurd. It's just 1 hero choice, but 1 hero can make an enormous difference in a campaign. This is really buying power when you're thinking about it. Going back to the Empire, we have the Hunter and the Beast DLC for Warhammer 2. This is the DLC that brought about the system of Imperial Authority, as we all know and hate it currently. But this is also a very important DLC for the Empire to have. Yes, even more important than Grim of the Grave. While it doesn't have something like an Archlector, the Huntsman General is not as good as an Archlector, I would argue. He's more useful to buff up the units in his army rather than combat ability. This DLC does contain some very significant things that the Empire absolutely needs to have a more viable roster. See, the problem for the Empire is that a lot of the units that it does have for a very significant amount of time are just not really that great. The entire infantry chain, with the exception of crossbowmen, is practically worthless until you get into great swords. That's by default, by the way. What this DLC does add are 2 units. One is a tier 1 archer that you can recruit from any from any settlement. Now, archers are not a great unit, but they are cheap. They're cheap enough, and I will demonstrate this with, say, recruiting another lord. They're cheap enough to recruit en masse. And while the Empire does have a decent enough economy, maintaining a large number of troops can be something of an issue in the early game. So having a cheap range unit that can recruit at tier 1 is quite important in your early game success. If you don't have archers, your army might as well be non-existent. Regular spearmen are worthless, swordsmen are not that great. Yes, you can make use of Free Company Militia if you have Volkmar's DLC, but not a great state to be in. And it's not like Free Company Militia are great either. So if you take out archers, the entire Imperial early game becomes quite awful until you start cranking up tier 2 armies, which you will not be able to afford in the large enough numbers to be able to deal with all the threats effectively. While obviously they lack the armor piercing that crossbowmen do have, again, they're decent enough to handle most of the threats you're going to be dealing with in an early game campaign. Unless it's Vlad and Festus, but that is just an issue, right? Later on, however, you get the Huntsman from any tier 3 barracks. You don't need another building to get these guys, and they're a very solid range upgrade. Like, you'd get archers, then you'd start getting crossbowmen, which are a genuine upgrade, and then you get huntsmen. Now, huntsmen do have the same missile strength as crossbowmen, though they also have a bonus versus large. They have 2 less armor piercing, but they have some very significant benefits in combat that counteract that. They have vanguard deployment, and they can fire while moving. Those 2 benefits together, and also stock. So they can be hidden, they can deploy close to the enemy, they can shoot the enemy. So if you're dealing with a slow-moving army, you can quite literally kill a significant portion of that army without them catching up to you. While they aren't the fastest unit in the game, they are actually faster on foot than many of your other early game units that you might recruit in a campaign. So they also have the benefit of speed. Like Free Company Militia can keep up with them, the rest of your army will not. And obviously, of course, cavalry are much faster than them, but that is a given. So the way a late game Imperial army should look is one where you've got great swords, huntsmen, artillery, and demigryphs. That is your late game Imperial army. With, of course, the addition of heroes in that army. So warrior priests, mages, witch hunters, captains, and so on. And of course, potentially a siege tank or 2 if you want to get really fancy over there and you can afford it.
The nation calls.
But effectively, huntsmen, I would say, form the core of the Imperial army together with great swords, because that is the solid core we build everything around: the artillery, the cavalry, and of course getting those heroes in an army. If you don't have this DLC, to be quite frank, it's not worth playing an Imperial campaign. That's how important I think this DLC is. If it wasn't for the fact that the Empire was in such a sorry state as a race, and honestly, there's a strong argument to be made that it's not worth buying this DLC because the Empire is quite crap at the moment. If it wasn't for that situation, I would even rank this DLC higher, but the reality is, even with this DLC, the Empire is still in a pretty miserable state. Who knows, maybe Thrones of Decay will bring about much needed improvements. At number 2, we have the King and the Warlord DLC that came out for Warhammer 1. Skarsnik doesn't count, really, from my perspective as a Legendary Lord, so you're not really interested in that. Belegar has more potential in his campaign, but he's not worth playing. It's more interesting to confederate him. He is a good Legendary Lord to confederate, not necessarily so much to play. From the Dwarven perspective, this DLC does add something that is quite important. The Dwarves are in a pretty bad state as a race, and they need every advantage they can get their hands on in a campaign. So what this DLC adds for Dwarves are the Rune Lords. And Rune Lords are such a good lore choice for the Dwarves that, as far as I know it, in multiplayer, the recommendation is to never use the regular Dwarf Lords, or to even use any other Legendary Lord with the exception of Thoric, because a regular Rune Lord will be better than every Legendary Lord of Dwarves with the exception of Thoric, who is a Rune Lord himself. So you have that to take into account. So this DLC is quite important for the Dwarves to help them out in some way in their campaign. But of course, the Dwarves are a pretty bad race at the moment, and they do desperately need some improvements. However, for the Greenskins, this DLC, while it does offer a new lore choice. You never want to use it. Like, never, ever use something like a Night Goblin War Boss. There's no reason. Let me explain. If you're looking for a melee combatant as the Greenskins, it is generally a far better solution to go for a regular Orc boss. That's just something to take into account. And if you're looking to lead a Goblin army, a Night Goblin War Boss is not a great choice because he's missing the crucial skill that Goblins do want. That skill is called Goblin Tide. You get a rank 10, gives you 15 armor for Goblin units. So from this DLC's perspective, the lore choice is not important. Though it is worth pointing out that this is the principal DLC with regards to Regiments of Renown for both of these races, for both the Dwarves and for the Greenskins. Actually, this is the only DLC that affects the Dwarves from a Regiments of Renown perspective. But there is one unit that is quite absurd that's part of this DLC, and it's probably one of the strongest DLC units in the game. People talk about Akshina Ambushers. As far as I'm concerned, Akshina Ambushers have nothing in comparison to Nasty Skulkers. While they probably don't scale quite as well in a long-term campaign, the important thing about Nasty Skulkers is that they give the Greenskins a very powerful early-game unit that they need. Without this DLC, you're just basically stuck as the Greenskins recruiting Goblin Archers because that's the best choice, and then moving on to Night Goblin Archers, and eventually as you get to tier 3, Orc Biggins. Nasty Skulkers are so powerful, you may not give a shit about the Biggins, because while Biggins are certainly decent enough, they would actually lose in a straight-up fight to win the Nasty Skulkers. What makes Nasty Skulkers so crazy is a combination of things. One, a lot of the early game Greenskin research directly concerns the Goblin. So you get research that gives melee attack, upkeep, leadership, armor, quite very importantly, and various other benefits like casualty replenishment, physical resistance, all that kind of stuff. Like, all of this is available relatively quickly in a campaign. Like, this is a turn 16 campaign. And yes, I am playing Grimgor, who is Grimgor. You want to understand what makes Grimgor strong? This is a legendary campaign, I might add. Look at what I've achieved. Actually, look at what I have achieved. Just gonna point that out. But it wouldn't be possible without something like a Nasty Skulker, unless you're willing to cheese the game, basically. What makes Nasty Skulker so powerful? Beyond the fact that they get a lot of research benefits early on that turn them from a pretty crappy unit, actually, in quite a few ways with low survivability, into a unit that has more armor than many of the early game Imperial roster who wears plate. Yes, we can talk about the balancing of campaign of the Empire versus the Greenskins. It is that fucking absurd. But still, you have a cheap unit, a very cheap unit to use in a campaign that may murder even tier 3 units. Actually, there are few ways to directly counter a horde of Nasty Skulkers in a campaign. Let me explain. I used to think originally Nasty Skulkers were crap, but I was very mistaken. They weren't that great in Warhammer 1 and 2. They changed some things in Warhammer 3. It's because they didn't have quite as many absurd benefits, as I would say. Especially when they were introduced. So, here's the thing about Nasty Skulkers. The vast majority of their damage is armor-piercing damage. That's already a substantial enough benefit that means that they can compete against much higher tier units, even if their survivability is not that great. You can't counter them properly with cavalry because cavalry relies on charging to be effective, and they have smoke bombs to directly counter cavalry or any kind of charging unit. They have vanguard deployment. They've also got stock, so range masses, yeah, range units would tear them to shreds if they could see them. And given the way range works, by the time you'll see them, they'll probably be closing in on in melee and ready to tear your entire front line in half. And then you have the opportunistic murderer. This is the part that is absolutely ridiculous. So you already have a unit that can get a good level of armor, especially if you get Goblin Tide. Keep that in mind. Like, you're looking at a ridiculous level of armor there with Goblin Tide on what should arguably be the worst lore choice for the Greenskins, but turns out to be the best because of the Nasty Skulker because of the benefit they can give directly to Nasty Skulkers and Goblin Archers, I might add. But then you have a 12 melee attack, so they end up with more melee attack than many higher tier units. They'll do more damage than many higher tier units, and you can mass them cheaply. As I stated, this unit wasn't so great in Warhammer 1 and 2, partly because of the range meta of those games. That melee meta is really the name of the game in Warhammer 3. So a combination of Nasty Skulkers and Goblin Archers will defeat much more powerful armies than they are. Throw in some trolls for good measure, and you've got yourself an endgame army basically from the start. It won't scale so well in the late game, but here's the thing to understand about what makes Nasty Skulkers so dangerous in a campaign, and why this DLC is quite essential for the Greenskins. The Greenskins are all about momentum in the campaign. If you get the ball rolling as the Greenskins, you will annihilate your foes. If you're stuck on that in that respect, you will struggle. Nasty Skulkers allow the Greenskins to dominate the early game and build themselves something like this. Now, it is possible to achieve this level of success without using Nasty Skulkers, sure, but it would be a much harder battle to win Zarnagrun unless you're willing to use sieges to do so. So it helps the Greenskins at the critical stages of the campaign, which are the early game, and it helps you build a very large and powerful empire. And by the point that Nasty Skulkers become less than relevant units in a campaign, you've got other units to replace them. Black Orcs, Biggins, or in this case, Ragnarok Spiders and Trolls. Already, yes, I kind of let myself go over here in this particular campaign, what can I say? That's what makes King the Warlord so important. Not a great DLC for the campaigns, but if you're looking to play a Greenskin campaign and steamroll the entire world and be Ragnarok, this is the DLC you should get. Finally, on number 1 is the Champions of Chaos DLC, which in theory is a DLC that gives you Warriors of Chaos benefits, but it's not the Warriors of Chaos that benefit the most from this DLC. It's the Demons of Chaos. The only Legendary Lord I would say doesn't need this DLC is the Changeling and those of Change, and that DLC is absolutely not worth it unless you're looking to play Jan Bo. That's a different discussion. But this DLC is in many ways quite absurd, and it really reveals how horrible the demonic race was before the release of the Champions of Chaos, and how pathetic they still are. Like, you have a DLC where you require units from a completely different race to make it work. That isn't a great situation. And with the exception of Skarbrand, I would call it essential for every other demonic campaign. It doesn't matter if it's Nurgle, Kairos, or Nakari, you will want to own the Champions of Chaos DLC. But why is that? Well, Champions of Chaos contains a whole host of content. Lore choices, hero choices. Like, it's probably the most rich in content DLC, or has the largest number of units of any DLC pack. Yes, they are reskins, but that doesn't mean they're not important. They are important for all these races. If you want to play a campaign as any of the demons, it is highly recommended. Even Skarbrand can handle himself fairly well even without this DLC, but he still will benefit from having this DLC. Like, look at Nakari, this situation. You get a lore choice for this DLC, the Chaos Lord. You get the hero for the Chaos Sorcerer of Slaanesh in the Temple of Decadence. And quite importantly, in a Slaaneshi campaign, you get Chaos Warriors of Slaanesh. One of the biggest problems that Nakari has is that even though Nakari has a bunch of really powerful campaign mechanics, the actual unit roster of Slaanesh is freaking awful. And you have poor casualty replenishment, so it's difficult to recover from battles, and you'll probably have to fight a lot more battles manually. The Champions of Chaos fixes this issue by giving units with high levels of armor durability that can do quite well in auto-resolve and manual battles. So you're no longer stressing yourself out. While Chaos Warriors of Slaanesh are not necessarily the best Chaos Warriors. They're not. They're at least fast. It's not just the Chaos Warriors, it's also Chaos Knights of Slaanesh with Devastating Flanker that are probably one of the most brutal cavalry units in the entire game, just because of the 120 charge bonus that they can get thanks to courtesy of Devastating Flanker. So this DLC for any demonic campaign is essential. We're talking here 5 Legendary Lords, even discounting Daniel, it's still 4 Legendary Lords that do benefit immensely from it. So if you're looking to play any demonic campaign in the game, this is the DLC you would want to own. Now, the question is, of course, would you want to play a demonic campaign? Well, I think the Kari's campaign can actually be a lot of fun in the early game. Later on, it does kind of devolve into a mess because of the vassal situation. But there's certainly a lot of potential and actually fun to be had in the Kari's campaign, because you have a really brutal campaign early on, but it is one you can succeed by utilizing the campaign mechanics well. But it's not the campaign to be recommended if you do not own this DLC. I have to stress that part out when we're looking at this. If you're looking to play any campaign as Kairos or Kugaf, as horrible as those campaigns can be and are, it is very much essential. If you're looking to play a campaign as Skarbrand, it is a huge benefit there as well. Not something to be dismissed. So while I and many others, for that matter, do dislike how Creative Assembly treated the baseline races of Warhammer 3, and still do dislike how they treat those races, this is a very important DLC to own for any demonic campaign. Or any Chaos campaigns. It's not like the Warriors of Chaos won't benefit from this DLC. They will. That's the thing. But it's far more important for the demons to play. Whether or not you want to play a demon campaign, well, I would actually sooner play a campaign as Nakari than one as Karl Franz, even with all the DLC that you can get for Karl Franz. That's just my perspective. Seniors signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.